You don't like to talk then?
Well, not really. Sometimes if there's something to say, but there's really nothing to say these days.
In the pantheon of rock and roll legends, few stories are as layered, as emotionally complex, and as quietly devastating as the story of George Harrison. He was the man who stood in the shadows of two of the most celebrated songwriters in music history, yet burned with a fire that most people never saw coming. We talk endlessly about the tension between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Their rivalry has been dissected in books, documentaries, and countless interviews. But what about the tension that lived in the quieter corners of the Beatles' story? What about the grudge that George Harrison carried, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, privately, and with a weight that never fully lifted until his dying days? Today, we are pulling back the curtain on a relationship that defined George Harrison perhaps more than any other in his extraordinary life. A relationship built on admiration, brotherhood, and creative ambition, but also on dismissal, domination, and emotional wounds that scarred him for decades. Because when you look carefully at the full arc of George Harrison's life, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. There was one person he struggled to forgive more than anyone else in the world. And that person was not a stranger, not an enemy, not a critic. That person was someone George called his friend, his bandmate, his creative partner, and ultimately the man who he believed held him back from being everything he could have been. To understand the depth of George Harrison's resentment, you have to go back to the very beginning. George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, in Liverpool, England, the youngest of 4 children in a working-class household. His father, Harold, worked as a bus conductor, and his mother, Louise, was a warm, music-loving woman who instilled in George a deep sensitivity toward sound and spirituality from his earliest years. She would listen to broadcasts of Indian music while pregnant with George, drawn to the mystical rhythms of sitars and tabla drums. Whether or not that shaped his later obsession with Eastern music is open to interpretation, but it is a beautiful detail that hints at the kind of soul George Harrison was born to be. Growing up, George was not the loudest kid on the block. He was thoughtful, observant, and intensely curious. When he heard Elvis Presley's music drifting from a neighbor's window while riding his bicycle as a young teenager, something inside him ignited. He became obsessed with the guitar in a way that few teenagers ever become obsessed with anything. He doodled guitars in his school notebooks. He dreamed about playing. He badgered his mother until she scraped together enough money to buy him his first guitar, roughly £3 and 10 shillings, a sum that represented a genuine sacrifice for a working-class Liverpool family. What followed was a journey of relentless self-improvement. George practiced constantly, learning chord shapes from family friends, studying records, and developing a precision and musicality that would eventually earn him recognition as one of the most technically gifted guitarists of his generation. But in those early years, what George Harrison wanted more than anything was simply to belong, to find his people, to find his band, and to play music that mattered. The story of how George Harrison met Paul McCartney is one of rock and roll's most charming origin tales. They were schoolboys riding the same bus, bonded by a shared passion for music. McCartney, a couple of years older than George, recognized something special in this quiet, guitar-obsessed kid. They began practicing together, swapping chords and techniques, building a musical friendship that felt natural and easy. Through McCartney, George was introduced to John Lennon and the Quarrymen, the skiffle group that would eventually evolve into the Beatles. Lennon's initial reaction to George was less than enthusiastic. At just 15 years old, George was deemed too young by Lennon, who was already fiercely protective of the group's direction and image. But George was persistent. He arranged a second audition on a Liverpool bus and played the lead guitar break of a popular tune so cleanly, so confidently, that Lennon had no choice but to take him seriously. That moment, that bus audition, is in many ways the perfect metaphor for George Harrison's entire career. He was always proving himself, always auditioning for a respect that should have come naturally, given his obvious talent. Even when he earned his place in the group, the hierarchy was already established. Lennon and McCartney were the songwriters, the faces, the voices of the Beatles. George was the guitar player, talented, indispensable, but always operating within a framework that others had designed. When Beatlemania erupted in the early 1960s, it transformed 4 young men from Liverpool into the most famous musicians on the planet almost overnight. The scale of that fame is difficult to fully comprehend even today. They cannot walk down a street, check into a hotel, or board an airplane without being mobbed by tens of thousands of screaming fans. The world had never seen anything quite like it, and it never would again. But while Lennon and McCartney were absorbing the spotlight and feeding off the adoration of millions, George Harrison was navigating a different kind of experience. He was beloved by fans, certainly, but within the internal structure of the Beatles, he occupied a specific and sometimes frustrating role. He was the lead guitarist. He was the quiet one. He was in many respects the employee of a creative enterprise that Lennon and McCartney owned, and in those early years, Harrison's songwriting contributions were limited to 1 or 2 songs per album, if he was lucky. Lennon and McCartney were producing material at staggering rate, and the label, the management, and even the broader music industry expected Beatles albums to be dominated by the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership. This left little room for George, who was rapidly developing his own voice as a composer but had almost no outlet to express it. His debut as a Beatles songwriter came with the track Don't Bother Me on the 1963 album with the Beatles. It was a solid, moody piece that demonstrated real promise. But it was followed by long stretches where Harrison's compositions were either shelved or given minimal space on records. For a man of his talent and ambition, this was not merely a professional inconvenience. It was a slow, grinding humiliation, made worse by the fact that it came at the hands of people he genuinely cared about. By the mid-1960s, George Harrison was undergoing one of the most profound artistic transformations of any musician in that era. His discovery of Indian classical music and Eastern philosophy opened up entire new dimensions of creative expression. His introduction of the sitar into Beatles recordings was not a gimmick or a passing trend. It was the beginning of a serious, lifelong engagement with a musical tradition that would eventually define a significant part of his artistic identity. Albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver saw Harrison contributing increasingly sophisticated material. His composition Taxman, which opened Revolver in 1966, was a sharp, politically charged piece of songwriting that demonstrated a maturity and perspective entirely his own. His exploration of Indian musical forms on tracks like Love You Too was groundbreaking, earning him genuine recognition from ethnomusicologists and music critics as a pioneering voice in cross-cultural musical exchange. And yet, despite all of this, the internal dynamics of the Beatles remained largely unchanged. Lennon and McCartney continued to dominate the creative direction of the band. Their songs received more rehearsal time, more studio attention, and more promotional energy. George's contributions, however brilliant, were still treated as supplementary rather than central to the Beatles' identity. This is the context in which George Harrison's deepest frustrations were born. And while much has been written about his conflicts with Paul McCartney, and those conflicts were very real and very significant, the relationship that truly haunted Harrison, the one that left the deepest emotional marks, was with John Lennon. John Lennon was, by virtually every account, a person of extraordinary charisma, intelligence, and creative power. He was also, by virtually every account, someone who could be cutting, dismissive, and sometimes genuinely cruel to the people closest to him. He wielded his wit like a weapon, and he rarely seemed to consider the collateral damage it left behind. For George Harrison, his relationship with Lennon was one of the most complex and emotionally loaded of his entire life. On one hand, Lennon was the person who had opened the door for Harrison in the first place, the older, cooler, more established figure who had taken a chance on a 15-year-old kid with a guitar. That counted for something. It counted for a lot. And Harrison's admiration for Lennon's talent was genuine and deep. He considered Lennon one of the most original creative minds he had ever encountered. But there was another side to their relationship, one that grew darker and more painful as the years passed. Lennon had a habit of treating Harrison's contributions with a casual dismissiveness that was, in its own way, more wounding than outright hostility would have been. He rarely championed Harrison's songs the way he championed his own or McCartney's. He sometimes openly mocked Harrison's spiritual journey, his deepening devotion to Indian philosophy, meditation, and Hare Krishna, treating it as naive or indulgent rather than as the sincere and profound personal transformation it actually was. This mockery stung Harrison in a particular way because his spirituality was not a phase or an affectation. It was the core of who he was becoming. It was the thing that gave his life meaning beyond music and fame. When Lennon dismissed it, he was not just dismissing a hobby or an interest, he was dismissing the most important part of George Harrison's identity. In 1980, George Harrison published his memoir, I, Me, Mine. It was a deeply personal document, a meditation on his music, his life, and the values that had guided him. It covered decades of experience, hundreds of relationships, and an extraordinary journey through fame, spirituality, and self-discovery. And throughout this entire memoir, John Lennon was barely mentioned. For anyone familiar with the history of the Beatles, that absence was deafening. Lennon had been Harrison's bandmate for over a decade, his creative colleague, his fellow traveler through one of the most extraordinary adventures in the history of popular music. And yet in Harrison's own account of his life, Lennon occupied little more than a footnote. Lennon, for his part, was reportedly hurt and angry about this omission. He felt it was a deliberate slight, a way of erasing him from a story he had played a central role in shaping. And he was probably right, because George Harrison was not the kind of person who forgot things or let them go easily. He processed his wounds quietly, privately, over years and decades. And in I, Me, Mine, he made his feelings known not through angry accusations, but through the most pointed silence imaginable. This is the essence of who George Harrison was. He did not rage publicly. He did not hold press conferences to air his grievances. He expressed himself through his music, his spiritual practice, and occasionally through these quiet, devastating acts of omission that said more than any angry interview ever could. By 1969, something had finally shifted in the dynamics of the Beatles. The recording sessions for Abbey Road produced what many consider the finest work of Harrison's entire career as a Beatle. Two songs in particular, Here Comes the Sun and Something, were not just good Beatles tracks. They were masterpieces of popular songwriting, compositions that could stand alongside anything Lennon and McCartney had ever produced. Something, in particular, achieved a level of recognition that even the most partisan Lennon-McCartney loyalist could not dismiss. Frank Sinatra recorded it. It became one of the most covered songs in the history of popular music, second only to Yesterday in the Beatles' catalog. And in a remarkable moment of honesty, even John Lennon declared it the finest track on the album, but consider what it had taken to get to that point. Harrison had been fighting for creative space within the Beatles for over a decade. He had written brilliant songs that were shelved, overlooked, or given minimal studio time because Lennon and McCartney's material always took precedence. He had watched his contributions treated as filler between the real Beatles songs. And now, finally, in the band's twilight hours, his genius was being acknowledged, not just by critics and fans, but by his bandmates themselves. That it was vindication. But it was also bittersweet in the extreme, because the Beatles were already falling apart. The acknowledgement came too late to heal what had been broken, and Harrison knew it.